aka Henry McCarthy, aka Kid Antrim, or the Kid, but he's passed into history and legend, of course, as Billy the Kid. So a visit to the historic town of Lincoln, New Mexico, scene of the Lincoln County War. Just be aware that I filmed this in July 2023, and I think because of COVID, many of the places are still shut, and even the state monuments, they only open on a Thursday. And certainly you can film outside, as we're seeing here, but you'd certainly want to visit inside some of these buildings, particularly the courthouse where Billy made a famous escape from. So the idea is just to show you what you can see in Lincoln today. It certainly has an atmosphere about it. I visited Tombstone many years ago and then Dodge City last year, but I think Lincoln, New Mexico has the most authentic feel about it. So some of these are the structures. Here's one of the original structures that was put up to protect against raiding Mescalero Apaches. And then it also featured in the Lincoln County War, which was between the Dolan-Murphy faction and on one side and Tunstall, and of course Tunstall was killed, and then Billy the Kid and the Regulators on the other side. In fact, this street became the most dangerous street in America at one stage in history. So you probably know more about that than I do, but I just want to show you what you can see when you visit. This is the site of the McSween home, which featured in a battle inside Lincoln, a 5-day battle in 2 places, and eventually the Dolan-Murphy gang burnt the home down. McSween was killed, although his wife and children escaped, and Billy the Kid was in the house at the time and he escaped, and they never rebuilt that. So that's just showing you the site of where the McSween property was. McSween was a partner with John Tunstall, the young Englishman who came over to find his fortune and try and take some of the stuff from what was known as the house, the Dolan factor. Of course, they weren't going to let him do that, not that easily. But he built a stall here, which is still here, as we can see. Again, that is closed, and I think it's closed pretty permanently now. Not just so it doesn't open on a Thursday. Obviously, you can see the outside, and then you can look through the windows and get a feel of what it would have looked like back in Tunstall's day. On the corner, they still have an active post office in sense of post boxes, which are collected, I think, like once a week. And while we were there, the guy came up and collected the post. So this is a very original building, the Tunstall store. And John Tunstall was 26, a young Englishman when he was killed. He was basically murdered, and it really kicked off the Lincoln County War between Billy the Kid and the Regulators on one side, the Dolan faction on the other side, and they had their own gunmen as well, like the Jesse Evans gang. And it really was a war about power, money, and revenge killings. And a lot of deaths did occur. At the rear of the store, okay, so now we're looking inside. You can get a feel of what it looks like inside. They've actually plywood over the original floor to protect it when it was open. At the rear of the store are the graves of Tunstall, who was killed a few miles out of town by a posse that was supposedly come to arrest him. Unfortunately for Tunstall, he seemed to forget the fact that in this particular period of time, a Colt 45 trumped the law. And he rode out to meet the posse that was sent out to basically arrested, and he was basically just shot down, so the story goes, murdered in essence. And Billy and some of the other regulators witnessed it and then set upon revenge killings and these tit-for-tat killings that went on over a period of time, number of years actually, and finally finished when Billy, of course, was himself killed by Pat Garrett in 1881. So at the rear of the Tunstall store there are two marked graves, Tunstall's and McSween's, but they say there's probably a dozen graves from the cowboys here, the various sides, and they're unmarked now, but obviously been lost over time. As you see, it wasn't that many people when we visited, and didn't see any of the local residents at all. Maybe because the temperatures were very high, everybody was indoors, but there weren't that many tourists. I was surprised how few there were, considering the how popular Billy the Kid is. He's probably the most well-known Western figure throughout the world, I would guess. So there's the grave of Alexander McSween, Tunstall's partner, and there's Tunstall's grave. Making his fortune in America. He wasn't fresh off the boat. He'd been in California before coming to New Mexico, and I think in British Columbia before that. But he'd heard that, there was money to be made here because the Dolan Murphy faction had monopoly, which he tried to break. Now, one of the Dolan Murphy allies was the sheriff William Brady, and he was murdered together with one of these deputies there, and that's the spot, by Billy and the regulators who came to visit the Tunstall store. And at the time, where that house was, there was a larger corral that came out from the store, an adobe wall corral, and Billy and the regulators hid behind that. And as Brady walked from what was known as the house, the store of Dolan's, to the original courthouse, they opened up with their Winchesters and just gunned him down, basically. So him and one of these deputies were murdered on the streets, and that was the crime that Billy was later sentenced to death to hang for, the killing of the sheriff Brady and his deputy. And Brady was actually a very well-respected person. He'd been in the US military, got an excellent record from that, been appointed the sheriff, but he definitely did side politically with the Dolan Murphy factor. This is the Wortley Hotel, and this is where one of the deputies, Bob Ollinger, was eating with some of the other prisoners when Billy made his famous escape, which we'll be looking at. This isn't the original building, that burnt down I believe, and this was rebuilt, but it's no longer a hotel, it's now private residence. Again, at one stage I think you could stay there, but I think COVID stopped that, and it's now a private residence. And just where the white truck is in the distance, the guys working on the power lines, that's the historic building that you certainly want to get inside. So again, bearing in mind they only opened it on a Thursday, and that's the Lincoln County Courthouse, but originally it was the store of the Dolan faction. To visit that, you buy tickets from the nearby visitor centre and museum, which we'll take a look at, which is excellent as well in its own way. So Bob Ollinger walked across to the Lincoln County Courthouse. This is an old house of Dolan that he built after the Lincoln County War was over. Again, that's not open. You're just viewing this from the outside. They, in the end of the day, failed, even though, in essence, they put the regulators out of business as well, but ultimately their business failed. And, of course, today, probably only Billy the Kid is known internationally. All these other names have been lost into history over time. I think that was the site of a building where Billy was, Lew Wallace, the governor, and he supposedly was granted amnesty, but that didn't go well for him as well in the end. So it does have a very original feel about visiting Lincoln. It certainly does. It's certainly not a tourist trap. There wasn't one shop open. And that's the earliest courthouse. That's where Sheriff Brady was walking down to from the other main building, which at the time was the dry goods store for the Dolan Murphy faction. And that's when he was ambushed with his deputies walking down to that building. That's another building that I believe was involved in this 5-day shootout, where there were some Mexican, Hispanic regulators, because Billy seemed to have an affinity with the Spanish and local Mexican farmers, Hispanic farmers. Eventually the military came into place, and this is where Colonel Dudley's camping place was. There's a fort nearby called Fort Stanton, which again you can visit. We ran out of time to actually visit that, fortunately. And Colonel Dudley came down with the military to try and put an end to all this bloodshed. But I think he basically took the side of the Murphy-Dolan factor, and besieged really this Ellis store, which again was being manned by some of the regulators. So there was a battle going on in this place and at the McSween property, the one that we saw earlier that was burnt down. Again, private residence now, not a place you can gain access to, but obviously you get a feel from the building by looking outside. And here's one of the local inhabitants who wanted a drink of water, and he crosses the main street. It's probably not that many main streets in America that you can cross as a deer and not worry too much about the traffic. He's off down to the river to get himself a drink. We stayed at a place called Capitan and bed and breakfast, which is fairly nearby, and the nearest main town was Roswell, New Mexico. So there's an old adobe building to give you an idea of what one would have looked like back in the time. There is nowhere to stay in Lincoln. Say Roswell's the major place to stay, and then we also stayed in a place called Capitan. It's key, not that many people around, and this was July, which you'd think would be a busy period. But some people did turn up and were disappointed to see that on the Wednesday it was shut. We went back on the Thursday. Now this is the visitor centre where you buy your tickets, and they've got a very good exhibition here showing you what it would have looked like, various artifacts, firearms, badges, etc. Very well done actually for a small place, and it tells the story of Billy's capture and Billy's escape, and we'll be looking at Billy's escape when we visit the inside the old county courthouse. That's a picture of Bat Garrett, of course, a famous sheriff who ended the life of Billy in Fort Sumner, and we'll be visiting there as well. So this is well worth a visit to give the story of what Lincoln County War was about. Could have probably spent a lot longer in here actually. It's like all museums, if you really want to see everything and read all the notices, it would take you quite a while really. But it does lay out very well the story and pictures of the main players, and various things that had happened. A lot of tit-for-tat killings went on, that's for sure, revenge killings. Letters from Billy to Lew Wallace, who was the governor, brought in, and he was also famous for writing Ben-Hur. And though in theory he'd promised amnesty to Billy, he went back on that, and that's why Billy was then sentenced to be hung. And he was brought back to Lincoln to do that. And this is showing the multi-day battle that went on between the regulators, including Billy, and the Dolan factors as well. Jesse Evans' gang, who was on the side of Dolan. And that was finally ended when the military came in, and here's the McSween house that was set alight. He was killed, and Billy and some of the others managed to shoot their way out, basically. Some of the artifacts belong to McSween, and there's a picture of John Tunstall. He's often portrayed as an older man in some of the earlier films about Billy the Kid, but in fact he was only 26, I think, when he died. He come from quite a wealthy family in London, but he wanted to make his fortune in America. Now, the Dolan factors, they were ex-Civil War veterans. They were tough guys. Murphy and Dolan were tough men. Irish Catholics. They weren't going to let this young upstart Englishman come in and take what they'd taken a long time to build up. There was no way they were going to let him do that. So that's why you ended up with all this bloodshed. In a way, it reminds me of sort of, modern day mafia gang wars, when they kill each other for control of a territory or control of a particular business. And it seems to me like a very early version of that. I don't think there's too many heroes in this whole story. It was all about gaining power, and I think even Tunstall wasn't the white knights he's perhaps portrayed again. He was after making lots of money out of it, and I'm not sure he worried too much about the Mexican farmers as well. There's some of the artifacts from the McSween's property burnt down, and there's a map of the main street. I mean, it's probably only a mile long, if that. I don't think it would be a mile if you actually measured it in the main building areas. So, very easy to walk up and down or drive up and down if you want to, and spend some time just looking at the various buildings that we're seeing. The most dangerous street in America, it was labelled as. Don't think it holds that title today somehow. So they've got a lot of original documents here, a lot of original letters from the period, as Lew Wallace, that became the governor, the murder of Sheriff Brady. As I said, he was actually very well respected. He'd been in the military. He got an excellent record in the military. He'd emigrated from Ireland before, and of course he was just murdered in the streets by Billy and the other regulators. They saw it as revenge for the killing of Tunstall, basically. So this is what was called the house in the Lincoln County War days. This was the store of Dolan and Murphy, but then became Lincoln County Court building, and this is where Billy was imprisoned, waiting to be hung. So, as I keep mentioning, only open on a Thursday, and that's at this period of time, July 2023. I don't know if that's going to change, and it seemed to be because of lack of staff, and because they're still sort of recovering from COVID and the aftermath of that, basically. So if you want to go inside, and you definitely do want to go inside because it's got some very interesting things we can talk about, then trying to arrange that you actually visit on a Thursday. We were there on a Wednesday, but then we waited and came back on the Thursday so that we could visit inside the building. And there's the historic plaque telling us about it, the Murphy Dolan store, built in 1874. When they failed, eventually it became the county government and judicial centre for 33 years. And it was also at the time the office of Pat Garrett, the sheriff's office. And this is where prisoners were kept inside. They didn't have cells as such, they had shackles in the floor, which we would be able to look at. When we were there, they were doing some repair work and painting, renovation work on this building. As you can see, not many people around at all. So that gave a sort of atmosphere to it as well. And when we were there one day, we had the storm clouds gather, as you'll see, and that sort of again gave a bit of an atmospheric feel to the whole scene, basically.